Based on the title of this film, In the Shadow of Kassa, many may think that everything about the Laszlo Csatary affair that appeared out of nowhere in Budapest in April 2012 can be acquired from media reports. Laszlo Csatary's character and role were judged by many people based on what was published in domestic and foreign media outlets. This film is not based on the writings, reports, and videos published in the media, but what is contained in numerous national archives and private documentation found in various government archives. The film documents the true role of Laszlo Csatary, a former Royal Hungarian police assistant from 1941 to 1945, in the infringement of the rights of the Jewish and non-Jewish population of Kassa, today known as Kosice, and its surrounding area. The film does not contain any fiction or assumptions, but facts based solely on documents. These documents are and have always been freely searchable in the National Archives of Hungary and foreign archives collected over several decades. Their content and authenticity can be verified by anyone.
2012 őszén kezdődött el az a másfél évig tartó.
In the autumn of 2012, 1.5 years of research began on documents in the Hungarian and foreign archives on the Laszlo Csatary case. During this extensive research, many documents were obtained or reviewed. From the archives of Budapest, the proceedings of the Budapest People's Court in 1945 to 46 against Dr. George Horváth, who was a former deputy chief of police in Kassa, were among those obtained. From the Kassa government archives, the 1947 to 48 Kassa People's Court written proceedings against Dr. Laszlo Csatary, a former Kassa police captain, were obtained.
TK 358 per 1948 számú periiratanyaga.
From the Canadian Justice Department, the 1994 to 97 investigative dossier into the actions of Laszlo Csatary and Kassa in 1944 were also acquired.
2399/96 számú 5 kötetből álló dossziéja.
From the Budapest Investigation Bureau, 6 volumes of investigative material against Laszlo Csatary were acquired, which included the 1948 proceedings of the Kassa People's Court translated into Hungarian. The Canadian Justice Department also provided a letter of clarification regarding the emigration of Laszlo Csatary from Canada to Hungary, along with various private documents of Laszlo Csatary. He was neither deported from Canada, nor was his citizenship taken from him. On April 19, 2012, Ephraim Zurov of the Simon Wiesenthal Center in the Jerusalem Post disclosed that the most sought-after Nazi collaborator in the world was Laszlo Csatary, a former police officer in the city of Kassa, now in Slovakia. Zurov claimed Csatary was responsible for deporting 15,700 Jews to Auschwitz in the spring of 1944. He also stated that Csatary went to Canada after the war and alleged that in 1995 Laszlo Csatary was deprived of his nationality due to his role in the war and therefore left Canada for Hungary. This was not the case. A few weeks after the announcement, a massive and thoroughly contrived criminal record was attributed to Laszlo Csatary and appeared in the media. As a result, he was already declared guilty of the accusations by the media and the arena of public opinion. It was alleged that in 1997 he was deprived of his Canadian citizenship and expelled from the country because of his war crimes. That in 1941 several Jews were deported from Kassa to Kamenyec-Pdolsk, where they were assassinated. Then in the spring of 1944 he was instrumental in running a concentration camp established in a brick factory in Kassa, and at various intervals was partly responsible for deporting 15 to 17,000 Jews to Auschwitz. That during the launch of the fourth transport of victims on June 2nd, 1944, despite the request of Sándor Balkányi, he forbade the cutting out of vents on the train cars. That he was one of the law enforcement leaders in Kassa in October 1944 until the Arrow Cross rule of January 1945, and that he was involved in the murders committed. Due to the intense harassment of journalists and civilians, Laszlo Csatary was forced to leave his 12th District Jury Street residence and move elsewhere. Then, thanks to Ephraim Zuroff of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, staff members of the British tabloid The Sun, Ryan Perry and Ryan Flynn, on July 10, 2012, congregated in the 11th District at Jágoló Street No. 4, where they attempted to interview Laszlo Csatary in a seriously humiliating and offensive manner. That same afternoon, another move took place whereby Ryan Flynn tried to discover Csatary but could not find the location. The next day, on July 11th, Ryan Perry threw a note into the empty apartment mailbox, leaving his phone number and email address describing his erroneous version of the alleged war crimes. Soon after, the Israeli embassy in London thanked the two reporters for their work. The statement that Laszlo Csatary was found by the two British reporters was not in fact the case, because Ephraim Zuroff had been in possession of the address on Jágoló Street for a while. The address was in fact delivered by Zuroff through a so-called informer 1944. And in this way, the two journalists who were hardly familiar with the Simon Wiesenthal Center, but familiar with Budapest, did not have a tough task discovering Laszlo Csatary unexpectedly on July the 10th.
Az esete, aki érintetlenül nyugodtan él Budapesten, annak ellenére, hogy megfosztották a kanadai állampolgárságától, akkor ezek olyan eredmények. Itt Magyarországról kaptuk az információt az ő beazonosításához. A mai napon átadtam az új bizonyítékokat az ügyészség számára, amely még inkább alátámasztja azokat a bűncselekményeket, amiket Csatáry elkövetett.
On July 16th, a group called Mezhihis organized a flash mob at the Győri Street and Jágoló Street apartments, where the media was present in large numbers.
Az akcióról az ultramédia készített filmben számolt.
Ultramedia produced a film reporting the event, during which swastika labels were pasted all over Laszlo Csatary's residence. The harassment was relentless.
A magyar hatóságok tartóztassák le minél hamarabb, és járjon. Ő fogja kezdeni a munkát. Köszönjük szépen! Nagyon köszönjük, hogy feladta.
Szerelmi akkor színfora van, hanem köszönjük az újságot.
Én ezek saját nyelven. Ha lehetne halálbüntetés, akkor igen.
Július 17-én Ephraim Zuroff.
On July 17th, Ephraim Zuroff raised a question to the President of the Hungarian Republic in the Times of Israel in an open letter asking why Laszlo Csatary was not being held accountable. The question also arose as to why Laszlo Csatary did not turn to the public or to the courts because of the defamatory and insulting allegations in the media. This was simply because Laszlo Csatary did not want to be a public figure for the sake of his family. He was firmly convinced that the events that he knew of in Kassa belonged to the investigating authorities that were available to him at the time, and not to a trial by media or flash mob. Csatáry did not want his family to suffer because of this accusation. Besides, it was already obvious to him that the authorities were dealing with his case before Ephraim Zuroff's report on September 2011, and a subsequent investigation in Budapest was publicized on April 19th 2012 in the media. Laszlo Csatary then asked lawyers on several occasions for their advice, but the answer was always to wait for the official notice from the Justice Department. The expected summons, however, did not arrive. According to Article 27, the presumption of innocence in Hungary's basic legal principles, no one shall be deemed guilty until his or her criminal liability has been established by a court's final decision. On July 20th, 2012, Laszlo Csatary's bank unilaterally terminated his account contract with ordinary notice. In the meantime, activists and journalists were also trying to get information from immediate neighbors about him. On July 24th, 2012, 20 congressional representatives of the United States demanded in an open letter to the President of the Republic of Hungary and the Prime Minister that Laszlo Csatary be held accountable for the war crimes committed in Kassa in 1941 and 1944. They wrote this even before the case was fully investigated and no indictment was made against him. An obviously ill-informed rush to judgment by members of Congress. They had very little, if any, knowledge of the case previously and were dead wrong in their assumptions. On July 25th, Adam Gellért, a supposedly international lawyer, presented papers at a press conference in the Budapest Holocaust Memorial Center that he had found signed with the signatures of Laszlo Csatary. On these papers, it is obvious that the signatures that are 4 days apart are not the signature of the same person. Therefore, they could not have been the signatures of Laszlo Csatary. Adam Gellért also presented a statement by Rosie Weiser on her cruelty testimony made on December 5, 1945, when court proceedings against George Horvath were initiated at the Budapest Political Law Department in the Budapest People's Court. However, Gellért did not present Rosie Weiser's testimony made at the Budapest People's Court on March 30, 1946, in which she stated that she knew about Laszlo Csatary only from what she heard from others. She never met or saw Laszlo Csatary in person. On August 9, 2012, Esther Edler from the Canadian-Hungarian Hírlap worked with Adam Csillag, a Canadian film director, and traveled to Kassa to produce a video with Zoltán Balassa called Uncle Csatáry, A Journey to Kassa. Surprisingly, this film contains one of the first documents that show that the perpetrator of the offenses committed against Jews and others in Kassa was actually not Laszlo Csatary. The birth details and the description of Laszlo Csatary in this video did not coincide with the personal description of Laszlo Csatary, and the documents also proved that Csatary was no longer in Kassa after the end of October 1944.
A periratban lévő születési adat és a személyleírás nem egyezett meg Csatáry László korabeli személyleírással.
In September 2012, Slovak, American, and other media organizations reported that a lawsuit against Laszlo Csatary, a high-ranking official, was initiated in Slovakia as well, stating that as a senior police officer, on January 10, 1945, a 17-year-old boy was deported to Germany by him, but returned on the 14th of August to Kassa. Laszlo Csatary is documented to have only been an assistant to a high-ranking official at the time, and he could not have given this order. On March 25, 2013, a letter to the District Court of Kassa was served by mail. The envelope contained two official documents. The District Court of Kassa issued in the same envelope in 2013 the commuting of the death sentence issued in 1948 of Laszlo Csatary to life in prison and dismissed the complaint made by Laszlo Csatary regarding the sentence. The excuse was that they did not receive the complaint on time. It was actually sent 2 weeks early by Laszlo Csatary. The dates of the documents sent back in the envelope prove that Slovak jurisdictions did not deal lawfully with Laszlo Csatary. The date of the judgment was the 31st of January 2013. The date of rejection of the complaint against the judgment was the 14th of March 2013. The complaint rejection was translated into Hungarian on the 26th, while the verdict was translated into Hungarian on the 27th and issued on March 20th, 2013. The two documents were mailed from Kassa on the 21st of March 2013. Laszlo Chatary was then officially faced with the fact that he was sentenced to death in Slovakia in 1948 without any legal remedy on March 25th, 2013. Both the 1948 and the 2013 judgment and all the proceedings against him were lodged. The complaint to the Slovak Supreme Court was dispatched on the 27th of March 2013. An answer was never received from the Slovak courts, and the complaint rejection was posted in the press.
Néhány nappal később a budai központi kerület.
A few days later, Laszlo Chatary was given a summons from the Central District Court of Buda, which was scheduled for June 4th, 2013. In 2010, a lawsuit was also launched against MÁV, the Hungarian National Railway, by the Holocaust survivors and their offspring in Chicago with respect to the deportation by the railway of individuals to Auschwitz from May to June 1944. Laszlo Chatary could not attend this hearing because of poor health, but his legal representative made a full statement to the court on his behalf. It was a big disappointment for all those who expected to see Laszlo Chatary as a witness in court. Many had prepared for this occasion. On June 1st, 1984, an article was written by Miklós Gasko, which was a memoir of the former Kassa lawyer and written about Laszlo Chatary in an article called Death Trains, which actually appeared in court 35 years later.
A Csatáry László elleni kassai népbűnösségi tárgyalás követően 35 évvel később került sor.
In mid-June 2013, an envelope arrived from the Sam Houston University in Texas to Laszlo Chatary. The envelope contained a DVD with a letter from Professor Jean Baudon, a professor from that university. Jean Baudon inquired about Laszlo Chatary's health and asked for his opinion on a film titled Operation Last Chance, which he produced and which was to be presented in July and August in Kassa and Budapest to coincide with the planned hearing in Kassa and Budapest for Laszlo Chatary while he was under house arrest. The hearings never took place.
A tárgyalás elmaradt.
Chatary is the most wanted Nazi war criminal alive.
It was known to the highest echelons.
A filmet
The film was launched on November 19th, however, in 2013, under the title Night Trains from Kosice in France. The 52-minute film was based on the tragedy concerning the Weinberger, Bodon, and other Kosice Jewish families. In the film, Laszlo Chatary was set as a Nazi war criminal and reported that he was involved in the deportation of 15,000 to 17,000 people from Kassa to Auschwitz. There are people who appear in the film that talk about Laszlo Chatary: lawyers, historians, journalists, and surviving witnesses who never met Laszlo Chatary.
Újságírók
A person known as Informant 1944 mentioned several times in Ephraim Zurov's report also speaks in the film.
Meghivatkozott informátor 1944-ként megnevezett személy is. Csatáry László elfogása
According to Hungarian
július
law,
17-én
Article
a késő
28
éjszakai
states that
órában történt
a
meg,
person subject to
és
criminal
18-án
proceedings
a
shall have the right to a defense at all stages of the proceedings.
gyanúsítottként hallgatták.
Laszlo Csatary
Délután
was
a
detained on the
budai
17th of July in the late hours of the
háborús
night. He was
bűncselekmény
detained
megalapozott
as a suspect by the
gyanújával
Budapest
házi
Investigation
őrizetben
Prosecutor's
média
Office, the
élénk
BNYU.
érdeklődése mellett
In the
ügyészségi
afternoon
sajtótájékoztatót
of July
tartottak,
18th, the
amelyről
Buda
a
Central
Magyar
District
TV
Court
egy rövid
ordered his house
online
arrest on a
médián
suspicion of
összefoglalót
war crimes. Along with the media's interest, a press conference was held by the Justice Department on which the Hungarian TV published a short film summary.
Majd ezt megismételte idén július 9-én, értetlenségét fejezte ki, hogy a Csatáry úr miért nincs még gyanúsítottként kihallgatva. A budapesti nyomozóügyészség eljáró ügyészei a mai napon őrizetbe vették, és gyanúsítottként kihallgatták Csatáry Lászlót háborús büntet miatt, a BTK 165. szakaszába ütköző háborús büntet miatt. A gyanúsított tagadta a bűncselekmény elkövetését, érdemi védekezést terjesztett elő, tehát tett vallomást. A vallomásában kitért 1944-es kassai tevékenységére. A vallomásának a végén megjelenik az ilyen ügyekben egyébként szokásos védekezés, a parancsra tettem, és a kötelességemet teljesítettem. Azt kell, hogy mondjam, a vallomásából bizonyos mondatok alapján.
In relation to the content of the suspect's report, the usual defense of I followed orders was made on the basis that the service of any law enforcement officer and other armed service personnel must comply with the issuance of a command, as is the case even today in any country. Laszlo Csatary was interviewed on 12 occasions by the BNYU. However, in the suspect report by the BNYU, a report of 78 pages, no statement or phrase referring to anti-Semitism or racism can be read about Laszlo Csatary. He was not found to be anti-Semitic or racist in any way. At the time of the house arrest, Ephraim Zurov made a statement in the media and said, "How can you defend such a person?" As a consequence of this biased public statement, Laszlo Csatary's legal representation was provided by a lawyer appointed by state prosecution for criminal proceedings. According to this circumstance and the rules of his house arrest, which had the possibility of leaving the apartment for only 2 hours a day, it was practically impossible for Csatáry to obtain the documents and evidence required for a substantive defense.
Az egyik legkeresettebb náci háborús bűnösnek tartott Csatáryt emberek törvénytelen kínzásával, illetve körülbelül 15.700 zsidó haláltáborba küldésével gyanúsítják.
Egy ilyen embert őrizetbe venni, vagy pedig gyűjtögetni a bizonyítékokat. Szerintünk elég az elítéléséhez, hogy ő a gépezet része volt.
Azok a bizonyítékok, amelyek arról szólnak, hogy ő az, aki és része volt ennek a gépezetnek, azok minden kétséget kizáróan rendelkezésre állnak.
Minden kétséget kizáróan rendelkezésre állnak. A Csatáry a munkaszolgálatból visszahozatott nem magyar állampolgárságú vagy vitatott állampolgárságú zsidó embereket Kassára azért, hogy rögtön Kamenyec-Pdolskba vitesse őket 1941-ben. Ez is mutatja, hogy ő nem egy egyszerű szereplője volt ennek a történetnek, hanem mint magasrangú rendőrtiszt is, azt gondolom, hogy százados lehetett.
Vagy a legutóbbi eset, Csatáry Lászlónak, kassai rendőrparancsnoknak az esete, aki érintetlenül nyugodtan él Budapesten, annak ellenére, hogy megfosztották a kanadai állampolgárságától. Itt Magyarországról kaptuk az információt az ő beazonosításához. A mai napon átadtam az új bizonyítékokat az ügyészség számára, amely még inkább alátámasztja azokat a bűncselekményeket, amiket Csatáry elkövetett. Még mindig itt van, és ami még ilyen fontos, hogy megvannak a bizonyítékok is azokról a tettekről, amiket
The first section of the accusations against Csatáry involved the deportation of Jewish people from Kosice and Kosice surroundings between July and August of 1941 to the Kamenyec-Pdolsk concentration camps. The information provided to the Budapest Investigative Prosecutor's Office by Ephraim Zurav was based on the memory of the father of Marika Weinberger in Australia. According to him, in August 1941, Laszlo Csatary arranged 9 relatives of his to be deported to Kamenyec-Pdolsk, where they were all murdered. However, apart from the memory of Marika Weinberger, there were surviving witnesses who stated they met with Laszlo Csatary in Kassa at a much earlier date. Karol Nemény, a witness in the Slovakian People's Court, swore that he had known Csatáry in 1939, who at that time was head of the passport section of the Kassa Police Department. In fact, Laszlo Csatary was actually stationed in Kecskemét, some 350 kilometers away. He was nowhere near Kassa at the time. Steve Shush, on November 16, 1993, during a testimony at a Canadian federal court, said that he had met with Csatáry in 1940 or 1941 in Kassa as a regular customer of his parents' shop. All this was in contradiction to the fact that Laszlo Csatáry was appointed by the Hungarian Minister of Foreign Affairs on the 5th of July 1940 to a Kecskemét police station. Laszlo Csatáry was discharged from the army in 1938 and lived for a while as an unemployed graduate from the law school of the University of Debrecen. Later he worked in a law firm for a few months. In December 1939 he worked as a mill supervisor in Szolnok. In December 1941 he was appointed to a Kecskemét police station as a police officer, from where in spring 1942 he was sent to the South Zombor detachment. He was then moved to the Kassa Highlands in the autumn of 1942. So in fact, it was not possible for the unemployed graduate Laszlo Csatáry in 1939 to be the head of the passport department at the Kassa police station in 1940 or 1941, or be a regular customer at István Szász's parents in Kassa. In the summer of 1941, during the war with the Soviet Union, the Kecskemét police station trainee would have to travel to the town of Kassa, 350 kilometers away, from the 15th of July to the 12th of August 1941 to deport relatives of Marika Weinberger or anyone else. This travel would be to a town where he was not even stationed. That did not happen. It would not have been not only physically impossible, but logically impossible and against orders. The second period of time for which Laszlo Csatáry is accused of crimes covers the events of April to June 1944 in the Brickyard Ghetto in Kassa regarding the deportation of Jewish people from Kassa to Auschwitz. Laszlo Csatáry was considered by many to be the commander of the Kassa ghetto on the basis of various witness testimonies and documents, one of which was an announcement issued on May 1st, 1944 in Kassa. On the footnote of the published section, there is listed a name and a common name. For example, Dr. Laszlo Csatáry, police officer, ghetto commander. In fact, Csatáry was only an assistant to the ghetto commander, who was Dr. George Horvath. In the spring of 1944, several announcements were published in Kassa, which did not indicate the signatory's personal name, only his official name. Nevertheless, there was no explanation for the fact that the signatory, captain of Kassa, was Dr. George Horvath, who was actually also the commander of the ghetto. The announcement had implications for all the administrative areas of the city of Kassa, along with the introduction of complex measures. The right to dispose of property was governed by Article 39, 1921. The publication could only be signed by an official who was individually entitled on his behalf. Such a right in Kassa only Dr. George Horvath had as deputy captain of the area. Laszlo Csatary, a police assistant, did not have the right to act as captain or to grant any permission. For anyone who was unaware of the rules on the right of the empowerment of the officials, it was the responsibility of the publisher in the printing of the publications to specify the rules of the Hungarian spelling of common names. From a simple logical error, Laszlo Csatary's police assistant title in the police department and the ghetto was given an erroneous title. Therefore, Laszlo Csatary was erroneously considered a ghetto commander by other documents and was attributed false importance to two of these. In the 4 days, different reports were documented, and it could be easily noticed that two signatures were not identical. The document of May 9, 1944 was signed by Laszlo Csatary on the basis of the report of the Commander-in-Chief, Sergeant Major Ferenc Sánta, and the document was tied to Laszlo Csatary and not his superior. Laszlo Csatary was merely an assistant to the commander. Laszlo Csatary did not carry out the task of commander of the urban ghetto at Zrínyi Street because he was not the commander at all, but merely an assistant. The question arises how Laszlo Csatary, a police assistant, could write a report for himself as the commander of the Kassa ghetto. Several documents prove that Laszlo Csatary was not the leader of the brick factory ghetto. Dr. George Horvath, in his testimony on March 23, 1946, at the Budapest People's Court, stated that first László Vidaházi, then Tibor Szú, became the commander of the Brickyard camp. This fact is even supported by the Yad Vashem Holocaust Institute of Jerusalem, published in 2003 and available on the internet. According to the accusations against Laszlo Csatary, on the fourth transport from Kassa to Auschwitz on June 2, 1944, despite the express request of Sándor Balkányi regarding those deported, Laszlo Csatary did not allow an opening to be cut on the freight wagons. The evidence by witnesses from both the Budapest and the People's Court of Kassa stated the fact that the event of not providing an opening mentioned by Sándor Balkányi never happened. Sándor Balkányi, in his testimony on the ban on cutting an opening window on January 10, 1946, also claims that, despite the permission of the German officers overseeing the event, the railroad cars already had vented openings. He then contradicted his earlier statement on the 3rd of April 1946 that in fact he was already dispatched by the first transport. The event he mentioned took place during the second transport of individuals from Kassa. Balkányi was never even there where he said the denial of openings was supposed to have been made. Furthermore, there was already a vent opening on the freight cars in question. Laszlo Csatary had no need or authority to permit openings since they were already there. The first transport from the Kassa brick factory actually started on May 15, 1944, which means that on June 2, 1944, Balkányi had already not been in the brickyard camp for 2 weeks. How could he had witnessed what Laszlo Csatary did or not do when he was not there? Dr. Samuel Yonap, a Jewish doctor of the last transport on June 2nd, did not even mention such an event during his testimony in the People's Court of Kassa. However, he mentioned that the police in fact gave permission to place bunk beds for patients in the wagons. Dr. Elamir Sass, who from the 16th of April 1944 to the beginning of the last transport and the commander of the Inner Jewish Guard until the collection camp was set up from April 16, 1944, also does not mention the Sándor Balkányi accusation. Also, the data of the Hungarian officer's name and address list issued in July 1944 documents that Laszlo Csatáry's status at the police station of Kassa did not change after the deportations and remained a police assistant, not a commander of any sort. The third period of time in question regarding the Laszlo Csatary case was between November 1944 and January 1945. During this period of time, Laszlo Csatary was no longer in Kassa. He was transferred to Budapest. Nevertheless, this was in contradiction to the proceedings which took place in Slovakia in 1947 and 48. As a former police chief of Kassa and an active member of the Arrow Cross Party, he was accused of being in charge of the deportations, claiming thousands of victims. In fact, members of the Royal Hungarian Police Force were forbidden to belong to any political party. The People's Court proceedings in Kassa include allegations of Auschwitz deportations in the spring of 1944, and surviving witnesses of the period from November 1944 to January 1945 testified to this. The court records included, among other things, Karol Neményi's testimony that he had known Csatáry as a leader of the passport section of the Kassa police departments since 1939. The testimony of Stephen Kiefer stated there that Csatáry arrested him for political reasons on the 2nd of November 1944. Zoltán Zurovsky's testimony stated that the arrest was executed by Csatáry's order on November 7, 1944. Apart from the questionable testimonies about Laszlo Csatáry, the special interest of the trial court in Kassa was a feature of this trial. It was held in the absence of the defendant, and its defender, Laszlo Csatáry, was declared guilty under questionable judicial circumstances. Whether an official court declared his judgment is also questionable. It is filled with mostly media representatives. Laszlo Csatáry was held responsible for the deaths of 12 persons hanged on January 5, 1945 on the main street of Kassa, despite the fact the death sentence was brought about and executed by Gábor Gártmányi, a chief of staff assigned to the operation of the government at the time. Laszlo Csatáry was stationed in Budapest by then. This case was investigated on January 9, 1945 by Dr. George Horváth, the Kassa police captain, which he personally completed. The cessation of these proceedings was ordered by the national leader Ferenc Szálasi. The 19-year-old Kassa man, who was arrested on January 10, 1945 and was deported to Germany, actually returned on August 14, 1945 to Kassa. But the case was still attached to the charges made against Laszlo Csatáry, even though no harm came to the man.
Csatáry László neve a dr. Horváth György volt kassai rendőrkapitány.
The name of Laszlo Csatáry did not appear during the trial of Dr. George Horváth, who was in charge of the Patriarch of Kassa, and was not mentioned in the period after the fall of 1944. The reason for this was that Csatáry was transferred from Kassa to Budapest in late October 1944 by the administration under Colonel Pál Hodosi, a police command led by Colonel Hodosi in Kassa under the direction of the Ministry of the Interior of Hungary. The details of the transfer Dr. George Horváth supported by his handwritten note orders that Laszlo Csatary be moved to Budapest, where he was to be transferred to the Ellátó group led by János Henke, Colonel of General Staff, who worked from November 1st, 1944 in Budapest. On December 2nd, 1944, Ferenc Szálasi went on to militarize all the police forces in Hungary, which meant that all police forces were then under military rule. According to this declaration, the police inspectorate continued to work under the direct control of the Ministry of the Interior. Based on this regulation, a list of the subordinates of the police inspectorate was prepared, which documents that Dr. Laszlo Csatary, a police assistant, was a liaison officer at the Henke group in Mosonmagyorvár, not in Kassa at the time. At a Canadian federal court hearing in 1996, Gőző Mészáros, a former witness and Kassa police officer, testified that Laszlo Csatary was in Budapest in October of 1944, and that he saw him there. These documents and testimonies prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Laszlo Csatary was already in Budapest in October of 1944, and could not have been in Kassa at the time. The Kassa testimonies about him being in Kassa were absolutely false. Laszlo Csatary's police career ended in January 1945, when he reunited with his family in Simbach am Inn, Germany. The U.S. military authorities subsequently investigated Laszlo Csatary's activities during the war, but found no objections. After the war, the powers of the victorious regimes were not really characterized by the losers of the war as being treated in a friendly manner. It is therefore concluded that if they found crime data that was related to Laszlo Csatary, they would have acted against him. They did not. In 1949, Laszlo Csatary moved to Canada with his family, where he became a citizen in 1955. In 1945-46 in Hungary, and in 1947-48, the Slovakian investigating authorities committed serious criminal and procedural mistakes. During the proceedings in Budapest and Kassa, all surviving witness testimonies where the name of Laszlo Csatary is mentioned, none of the witnesses knew who they were making testimony against. None of them knew Laszlo Csatary. Neither could they identify him. There was no cooperation between the Hungarian and Slovak authorities on cases of the events in Kassa either. Slovakia and Hungary were actually enemies at the time. The offender Laszlo Csatary then was not actually identified in any of the proceedings. They did not even attempt a recognition of him in proceedings, and were satisfied just with the mention of the name Laszlo Csatary without identifying him. As for the colleagues of Laszlo Csatary, it was clear in the Budapest People's Court procedure against Laszlo Csatary that the investigators did not ask for a description of him either. This was a serious mistake, because if the rule of law was to be complied with, as in any criminal procedure, the testimony of the surviving witnesses should have included a personal description of the accused. This error was also magnified by the fact that the surviving witnesses were not asked for a description of the person they knew as Laszlo Csatary. This serious omission, surprisingly, was not criticized by anyone during the proceedings. During the proceedings of the People's Court of Kassa, some surviving witnesses gave a description of Laszlo Csatary. According to their testimony, Laszlo Csatary was born on March the 4th, 1915, with a height of 176 centimeters, thin skin, chestnut hair, and eyebrows. Laszlo Csatary always had dark eyebrows. These figures and personal descriptions are related to the personal documents of Laszlo Csatary, such as his passport issued in Kassa in August 1943. The date of his birth is stated as March the 5th, 1915. His hair was blonde and he was tall. His German identity card, issued in Munich in 1948, has him with a height of 182 centimeters above his true date of birth. His nationality data, issued in Canada, has him at 6 feet, or 183 centimeters in height, and has him with light brownish hair. Laszlo Csatary, from his personal documents and a photo of the time, was a man above average height and almost a head taller than any of his police officer colleagues. He was clearly visible and stood out, was tall in height, and had a proportionately strong body, which in all respects complied with the requirements of application for a police officer. At the request of the Canadian Federal Court, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, investigated Laszlo Csatary's activities in Kassa in 1944 between 1993 and 1997. They did a thorough criminal reference check on him, including his career as a police officer. They found nothing that would be considered a crime, civil or war crime. They supplied Mr. Chatary with a document attesting to this. During the subsequent course of an extended international investigation in 6 countries by Canada, George Horvath was found to be the Kassa chief of police in the years 1945 to 46. The Canadian War Crimes Tribunal found out from Slovakia that Dr. Laszlo Csatary was a former Hungarian police officer in Kassa, who was tried by the Kassa People's Court in 1947 and 48. Experts were included and testimonies recorded of surviving witnesses in this Csatary case. The list of witnesses included 18 from Canada, 4 from the United States, 2 from Israel, 1 from Slovenia, 2 from Slovakia, and 2 from Tanzania. However, none of the 29 surviving witnesses had made a concrete statement nor an identification of the person who had committed crimes in Kassa in the spring and autumn of 1944. None of them knew or could not identify Laszlo Csatary. Even though photographs were presented to them, they could not identify him. When a group picture of members of the Kassa Arrow Cross Party were also presented to them, they could not correctly identify him at all. In fact, none of the witnesses had any idea what he looked like, although they had testified as being part of the Brickyard Ghetto. On November 22, 1993, Susan Kish testified he was a dark-haired, khaki-colored man in a gendarmerie uniform. But from a tableau she could see the person of Laszlo Csatary and could not identify him. Judy Lissy talked about a man with complexity, but did not identify Laszlo Csatary. Steve Shush, who encountered Laszlo Csatary in 1940 or 1941, could not identify him either. He could not do this because Laszlo Csatary was actually in Kecskemét at the time as a police officer. Stephen Kiefer, in his testimony together with several of his associates, who said Laszlo Csatary arrested him in November 1944, could not identify him because Csatary did not reside in Kassa at this time. It is interesting to note here that the Kassa People's Court actually first appointed Kiefer as Laszlo Csatary's defender, but he refused the mandate for obvious reasons because of conflict of interest. In 1993, J.K. Sasher was quoted as viewing the photographs during the Israeli procedure, but he was unable to identify Csatary either. Of the interrogated witnesses, only Győző Mészáros, who was in the fall of 1943 and in the summer of 1944 with Csatary as a colleague in Kassa, gave a correct description of the likeness of Laszlo Csatary. Only the description of the person he gave was identical with the personal description recorded in the private records of Laszlo Csatary. He was not mistaken because, according to his testimony, in 1943, when Mészáros was transferred to Kassa, he received a uniform from Csatáry so that he could introduce himself to the police captain of the area. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police completed the investigation in 1996 and sent the files to the Canadian Federal Court, which closed the Laszlo Csatary case in 1997 in the absence of a criminal offense. They found no criminal offense. In 1997, Laszlo Csatáry gave up his Canadian citizenship, and in the same year took up citizenship in Hungary. He was not deported, nor was his citizenship taken from him. The Canadian Department of Justice issued an official letter in 2015 stating that they did not know what motivated Laszlo Csatáry to abandon his Canadian citizenship. In this statement, it was also pointed out that Laszlo Csatáry did not have any pending judicial decision on immigration or any other case in Canada. He was not charged with anything in Canada. With this official letter, the Department of Justice of Canada actually contradicts Efraim Zurov's statement in the media in 2012 that Laszlo Csatáry was stripped of his Canadian citizenship and deported from the country because of his war crimes. This is obviously not true. In May 2012, in a newspaper article on the Felvidék Ma internet portal, Edith Solomon describes Csatáry as a man wearing a black dress with breeches and black boots, a person wearing a uniform of the Arrow-Cross Party service. This was not the uniform of the Royal Hungarian Police. According to the request of the Hungarian investigating authorities through Hungarian legal aid in February 2013, Edith Solomon was heard as a witness. The 8-page report shows that the witness did not know Laszlo Csatáry, never met him, and had only heard of him from others. The Investigative Prosecutor's Office of Budapest began investigating Efraim Zurov's complaint in 2011 and completed a criminal report against Laszlo Csatáry on the 18th of June 2013, and then sent the case to the Metropolitan Court of Appeal with an indictment. The indictment summarized the prosecution's position on 3 points, but all of them were already refuted by the documents that had been made available to the prosecution's office for a long time before the investigation had been completed. The charges described on the first part of the indictment were identical with those given at the first hearing on the 18th of July 2012, when the second point on the Kassa events after October 1944 was not concluded. This last point of the charge was terminated at the end of the investigation. Nevertheless, they upheld the accusations and testimonies of Emil Kovács and his wife, Zygmunt Schwartz and Dr. Schwartz regarding the death sentence handed down by the People's Court of Kassa, along with the testimony of Gábor Frentisch. All of these came to light in the proceedings, where surviving witnesses testified against a man whose personal description did not agree with the actual description of Laszlo Csatáry. The witnesses who made statements during the investigation conducted by the Canadian Federal Court for the same period reported their identity of a man who was very different from Laszlo Csatáry. In relation to the deportations to Auschwitz and other concentration camps, most of the historical data of Holocaust research states the fact that only some members of top government management in Hungary could have had information about the fate of the deportees. The persons responsible for the deportations, Andor János, Ministry of the Interior, Laszlo Baki, State Secretary for Home Affairs, and László Endre, State Secretary of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, were all appointed by the Budapest People's Court. Laszlo Ferenczi's guilt was established by the Budapest People's Court in 1946. Death sentences were executed in 1946. A reference was made here in the indictment that Laszlo Csatary's contribution to the transfer of deportees does not hold ground, because documents prove that the 7th district of Abu Gabor belonged to the gendarmerie district that included the district of Kassa, where the big factory was. The police force did not have jurisdiction over the gendarmerie at any level. Laszlo Csatary was a member of the police force, not the gendarmerie or the Csendőrség. They were two different police agencies. Laszlo Ferenczy, a Csendőr, was responsible for the deportations of the Hungarian people, as stated in the 1946 proceedings of the Budapest People's Court. Ferenczy admitted guilt in this matter later. The fourth accusation directed toward Laszlo Csatary for events on June 2, 1944, when the transportation by rail of the last Kassa victims to Auschwitz started, was a charge of banning the car window opening. This refusal not to allow openings in the railway cars did not happen. The testimony of Sándor Balkányi as surviving witness is refuted by the fact that he had been removed from the collection camp on the 15th of May. There is no mention in any proceedings other than by Sándor Balkányi forbidding the openings in the railway cars or any similar event. During the investigations of these three periods of time, severe contradictions of decisive importance have emerged. Laszlo Csatary was part of the police department of Kassa in 1939 in the passport office there. He was linked to the deportation and murder of 9 relatives of Marika Weinberger in the summer of 1941 from Kassa to Kamenyec-Pdolsk. However, the documents show that Laszlo Csatary lived in Szolnok as an unemployed graduate in 1939, and his appointment to the Kecskemét police station was only in January 1940. He was transferred to Zsombor in the spring of 1942 and to Kassa in the fall of 1942. During the time of the 1944 spring deportations, he was accused of, as a ghetto commander, abusing power in a leader of the collecting camp established in the Kassa brick factory. He was accused also of being whimsical and cruel and involved in 15,000 to 17,000 Jewish persons being deported to and dying in Auschwitz. He was accused with their death. However, according to the court records in the Hungarian National Archives and other archive documents, the testimonies of surviving witnesses in them, and the publication of Yad Vashem Holocaust Research Institute in Jerusalem, and the private documents of Laszlo Csatary, all proof is that not one of those violations was done by Laszlo Csatary. It is also proven that the perpetrator of the alleged offenses and the war crimes is not the same person as Laszlo Csatary. During the fall of 1944 and in January 1945, Laszlo Csatary was no longer present in the Highland city of Kassa during the period of the Arrow Cross power, or was he responsible for deportations of events relating to them. He was not there and is therefore innocent of any war crimes. The issue of Laszlo Csatary is very important to be resolved. If Laszlo Csatary had not resided in Kassa between 1939 and 1941, and had not been identified in a single proceeding as a perpetrator of the violations committed during the 1944 spring deportations, and if he was no longer in the town during the period of the Arrow Cross power after October 44th, who committed the crimes against Judaism in Kassa and its vicinity? The answers to the questions are there in the Budapest People's Court's records in 1946 and the Kassa People's Court 1948 court records. What is certain is that the person responsible for the crimes mentioned was definitely not Laszlo Csatary. He was simply not there.
197/1946 számú és a Kassai Népbíróság TK 358/1948 számú perirataiban, de ennek részleteiben történő feltárása már egy másik kutatás tárgya lehet. A büntető eljárás szabályai
According to the
szerint
rules
a
of criminal
törvényes
proceedings, there are
vádemelésnek
4
négy
necessary
szükséges
prerequisites
feltétele és elem
and
van.
elements for lawful prosecution. The first is, it is necessary for the law to punish the act or omission of a thing
vagy
against the person.
személyesen elkövetett tettet vagy mulasztást. A második,
The
amelyet
second
valahol,
is,
valamikor,
an act
valahogyan,
is necessary which
valamivel,
has happened somewhere, sometime, with something, somehow.
és a harmadik,
And the
egy
third,
büntethető
there
személy,
must be a punishable person.
a negyedik,
The fourth, there must be
szándékosan vagy
intentionally or by
valamilyen
negligence
okból
an
elkövetett.
act committed for some reason. If none of these 4 criteria are displayed, then no lawsuits
Amennyiben
can
a
be
négy
charged.
szükséges elem közül valamelyik nem jelenik
In the
meg,
Hungarian, Slovakian, and
esetben
Canadian
érvényesen
proceedings
vádok
related to
emelni
Laszlo
nem lehet.
Csatary, 2 of the 4 elements required were not proven. One was that at the start of the 4th transport
A
of
Csatáry
June
Lászlóval
2,
kapcsolatos
1944,
magyarországi,
a ban on a
szlovákiai,
ventilation
valamint
window
katonai
was not
eljárásokban
made,
a
and as a
szükséges
result, a
négy elem
war
közül
crime was not
2
committed.
bizonyítottan nem jelenik meg. Az egyik, hogy 1944. június 2-ai negyedik transport indításánál a vagonablak kivágás megtiltásáról szóló esemény meg sem történt, vagyis
The other
a
is that,
kegyetlenkedéssel
from the spring of
elkövetett háborús
1944 to
bűncselekmény
the
nem
18th
valósult
of
meg.
January 1945,
A másik,
violations committed in
hogy az
Kassa were not
1944
committed by Laszlo
tavaszától az
Csatary. He
1945.
was not
január
present at the
18-ig terjedő
location at the
időszakban
time.
a Kassán történt jogsértéseket nem Csatáry László követte el.
The collected and summarized evidence and documents were available until June 2013, and Laszlo Csatary's defense attorneys were awaiting the court hearing scheduled for September 2013, at which all of them would be submitted. His death on August 10th terminated the proceedings. After his death, in the media, extreme manifestations of all the false accusations against him appeared, which Laszlo Csatary could not defend.
A jeruzsálemi Simon Wiesenthal központ vezetője mélységesen csalódott, hogy Csatáry megmenekült az igazságszolgáltatástól.
Ephraim Zurov, earlier in a telephone interview on ATV on April 23, 2012, stated, "Then I knew." The question is, what did he know or come to realize? Perhaps Ephraim Zurov realized the truth would never be realized in court, that Laszlo Csatary was actually innocent.
Adatokat találtam a kassai zsidók 1944 tavaszán lezajlott deportálásában játszott szerepéről, és arra vonatkozóan, hogy milyen...
During the research and processing of documents, it became evident that Ephraim Zurov made the criminal accusations against Laszlo Csatary in September 2011 without taking into account the contradictions, incorrect facts, and false evidence in them. The aim then, it seems, was therefore not to reveal the truth, but to involve Laszlo Csatary in criminal proceedings at all costs, and to bring him to trial by media, and then in Hungarian court for some reason other than the truth. The death of Laszlo Csatary was caused by rapid pneumonia following a routine examination of a hospital in Budapest. This was unusual. Doctors only made a decision in a few days to move him to another hospital in Buda. After the transfer, despite medical treatment there, he died on the 10th of August 2013. As a result of the death of Laszlo Csatary, a final judgment pronounced by the court on his innocence was not established, even though the evidence was overwhelming that he was innocent. In Budapest in the autumn of 2014, a book was published by a Hungarian investigator titled In the Shadow of Kassa, the Csatáry Case in the Mirror of the Documents, which details the case of Dr. Laszlo Csatáry in the light of documents research. The book communicates to the reader the circumstances of the beginning of Laszlo Csatáry's career in the Hungarian Royal Police Force. It clarifies the reasons for his emigration to Canada in 1949 and 48 years later his voluntary return to Hungary. It discusses the questionable reasons for the criminal report of Ephraim Zurov in autumn 2011 and the media trial he launched and false accusations generated in 2012. It deals in detail with the fake accusations and the truth revealed in the documents in the various government archives and Laszlo Csatáry's undeniable proof of innocence, which must now be admitted by all concerned.